Call this meeting back into order. Bonjour et bienvenue tout le monde. This is
Hello and welcome, everyone.
number 32, the House of Commons Standing Committee on National Defence, which started on Friday, May the 21st, 2021. Please, if interpretation is lost, please let us know immediately so that everyone has the opportunity to fully participate in the proceedings. Reminder, all comments by members should be addressed through the chair. And when speaking, again, as a reminder to me as well as anybody else, please speak slowly and clearly. Our interpreters have been doing yeoman service, and we're asking an awful lot of them. So please do your very best to speak slowly and clearly and give them a break, because we all have a busy couple of weeks ahead of us, and we're relying on them very, very heavily. So please be kind to our interpreters. And with regard to a speaking list, the clerk and myself will do the best we can to maintain a consolidated order of speaking, whether you're participating virtually or in person. We are resuming debate on Mr. Bagnall's amendment to Mr. Bazan's motion. Mr. Bagnall has the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Last meeting, we heard a shocking revelation that had just come in that committee meeting. And that was that a member of our committee during this study that we're doing on sexual misconduct in the military did not think the committee should be hearing testimony that had been given by victims. Not hear testimony given by victims? That's incomprehensible. I'm sure there are other committee members that were just as shocked as I was. Not review testimony given by witnesses. What could be more important on this study? I could just imagine what some victims might be feeling when their testimony was being read at committee and a committee member said, that's not what we should be discussing. And it was not just any committee member, it was a senior member. I think that really provides a stark divide between committee members. As I have said so many times, I believe there are other members that feel the same way, that we should be taking the testimony of victims and experts and recommending solutions. But not reviewing and using the testimony of victims in designing a report is incomprehensible. I wonder what brave victims who came forward think when they are told we shouldn't be using their testimony. We should spend weeks upon weeks upon weeks of our time on an anonymous email that no one was allowed to see, while actually we have real victims.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Bagnall. Go ahead, Mr. Bazan.
I just think that this rant by Mr. Bagnall is that he's been somewhat chastised for using witness testimony for his political games. I think that what I said is we shouldn't be using witness testimony for filibuster. We shouldn't be using witness testimony without having the permission of those witnesses, and for him to say that anything other than that is disingenuous.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Bazan. Carry on, Mr. Bagnall, please.
Thank you. So the members just emphasizing the point of us not using that testimony.
Not for your grandstanding.
Well, we actually have real live victims who had the courage to tell their story. And an email that we're talking about, the existence of which was referred to investigators 24 hours and dealt with. But no, we have to discuss witness after witness after witness to discuss this anonymous email that no one knew what was in. Hear the testimony of witnesses that came? No, we must call back witnesses that had already appeared for 3 to 6 hours to talk about that email. What are we doing? What are we doing as a committee? There was a debate in the House on Wednesday night on GBA Plus in the House, and frankly, I was proud of a number of the members from different parties that spoke constructively. Fortunately, the member from our committee that just spoke who does not think evidence put on the record by victims should be considered, was not supported by speeches of the members in the House. The Conservative member for Calgary Skyview talked about survivors. And I'll just quote some of the things that she said. When that individual made an appearance before the committee, she recommended how and went on to talk about what she heard. When we heard from another witness who had reported an incident, went on to describe it. So many witnesses, women in particular, came forward to committee to express this lack of confidence. We even had a witness who gave very interesting perspective in the double standards that the military justice system towards women and men. And the Conservative member went on. This witness again discussed how when she was deployed in Afghanistan, an investigation had been conducted into a consensual relationship she had with a U.S. officer who is not in her unit, but of the same rank. She admitted that the relationship was against the regulations, and she pleaded guilty to the charges. She was fined, repatriated from theater, and posted out of her unit. She was accepted this as her punishment. However, as a result, she was called demeaning names and was told that she was not worthy of leading soldiers. She said that she was also threatened with violence by a commanding officer and was repeatedly chastised by the other officers. She was sent to work alone in an office managing a single Excel spreadsheet, and it quickly became very clear that her career in the Canadian Armed Forces was over. When she left the military, she had originally been given an offer to go into the reserves, but that was revoked when the commanding officer told her that she was not the type of leader he wanted in his unit. She said the biggest failure in her life were the actions for which she was pushed out of the Armored Corps. For that, she continued to carry immense shame. So obviously that Conservative member thinks testimony of witnesses is very important. The NDP member, Ms. Matheson, referred to the testimony of the status of women 2 days ago, Wednesday night. And I'll just quote. She said, Lieutenant Colonel Eleanor Taylor said, throughout my career, I've observed insidious and inappropriate use of power for sexual exploitation. And Christine Wood said, I feel like women have never had a level playing field in the armed forces. And Ms. Matheson also talked about culture is what we need to address with recommendations. And that's exactly what the Liberals for the last few weeks have been saying at this committee and giving evidence and information on how we could relate it to the culture. The Conservative member from Calgary Minipur also referred to evidence from the victims, witnesses in the status of women. So there was much reference to witnesses and very, as I said, some very constructive discussion. Now, in fairness to Mr. Bizan, there is a part of our study on sexual misconduct in the military that refers to General Vance. Given that there are thousands of incidents, victims, and perpetrators, my emphasis would not be on that one anonymous email that no one knows what was in, but that's Mr. Bizan's choice, which he's entitled to. But if he wants, and I've said I don't want to concentrate on General Vance, then he has to be honest about the facts and evidence that have been revealed recently, where it is shown that the major issue related to General Vance was his appointment in 2015. I can understand how that would be difficult for him, but the facts are facts. I won't go into the details on all those facts right now, but just the summary of the time of the appointment, Mr. O'Toole passed on through his staff, I believe, a rumor to PM Harper's chief of staff related to General Vance's alleged conduct at NATO in Maples. In tribute to Mr. Garrison, actually, I think he asked some of the best questions of Mr. Novak, and is now seen that I'm not sure if he got all the answers, but that he wanted, but has seen now that that was just the tip of the iceberg from information that's come out since. There was a hurried investigation. It was concluded that General Vance took over command the day General Vance took over command. Apparently an access to information request, and I assume that came from the press, said they felt that under pressure to complete the investigation, I'm not sure what led to that pressure, but it might have, depending on what it was, it might have been a very, very serious offense. But then there's a second rumor about inappropriate action at Gagetown. Apparently, the request was put forward to the National Security Advisor to investigate. I think it was that one. He neither remembers the request and certainly did not do an investigation. So there's obviously a lot more to be seen, a lot more here in 2015 than an anonymous email in 2018 that no one could see. And its existence was reported within 24 hours and acted on as far as possible. So if any committee member wishes, rather than listening to the testimony that had been recorded by victims and experts and efforts to come up with solutions for them to help the victims improve the military, would still rather deal with General Vance, then the facts show that the most serious questions about who, where, why, and when was at the Conservative appointment of General Vance. With these rumors and uncompleted investigations, why was he appointed? During the debate 2 nights ago on Wednesday night in the House, the Bloc member raised this issue of the Conservative appointment. And I will just read from the Hansard. Members should recall that the Conservatives had already caught wind of allegations against General Vance. However, they still appointed him as Chief of Defence Staff, even though the Canadian Armed Forces had just been roundly criticized for their management of sexual misconduct cases and pervasive sexist culture. Certainly, there is enough evidence that I've already outlined that any further discussions re General Vance should be concentrated on his appointment in 2015, in spite of uninvestigated rumors at the time. But for any committee member who still wishes to concentrate on General Vance, on June 1st, the Ottawa Citizen reported on their uncovering even more related to General Vance's appointment. And let me just quote some of that. Military police investigating allegations of an inappropriate relationship by General John Vance in 2015 never interviewed a senior officer, but did consult the satirical Frank magazine for information. The police investigation was hurriedly done just weeks before Vance to take on the top military job as Chief of Defence Staff. Hurriedly done. Is that a good way to start an appointment? The Canadian Forces National Investigation Service probe took just 4 weeks to wrap up, concluding there was no physical evidence Vance had a relationship contrary to military regulations, according to the documents obtained by the newspaper. Vance was never interviewed for the investigation, and police relied on the statement he provided a year earlier on the same allegation. In addition, a formal investigation plan was never created by the Canadian Forces National Investigation Service for 2015 probe, according to the records. A formal investigation plan was never created, although a member of this committee has said that the appropriate investigation was done. The investigation service, known as CFNIS, was called in after Lieutenant Christine Whitehouse received an anonymous email on June 10, 2015, claiming Vance was involved in sexual misconduct while he was posted at NATO as Deputy Commander and Allied Joint Force Command in Naples. The claim centered around Vance's 2014 relationship with a subordinate U.S. female officer whom he eventually married. The CFNIS was to determine if Vance followed military directives governing personal and romantic relationships between personnel. No direct witnesses were found by any of our sources of information relating to a physical act, stated the CFNIS investigation. Although, in spite of that, it did conclude Vance indeed had a personal relationship at the time with the U.S. officer. CFNIS tried to contact the anonymous source who claimed they could provide names of military staff who knew about Vance's relationship in Naples, but the police received no response. So still lots of unanswered questions. Vance, in his previous statement, denied any wrongdoing. Investigators also reviewed in April 2015 an article in the satirical magazine Frank, which outlined allegations about Vance during his time in NATO and the article was titled "Humor in Uniform," etc. But the police later determined, although it didn't have an effect at the time on the Naples headquarters, police later determined, given time, this personal relationship would likely have had a detrimental effect. So why would you appoint someone under those conditions? In addition, the investigation examined concerns about Vance's statement to the Vice Chief of Defense Staff, Lieutenant Guy Thibault. Vance had claimed that he had no command relationship with the U.S. officer. Though the statement by General Vance was technically correct, there would also likely have been times that Lieutenant General Vance was in commander of the U.S. officer. So technically correct, but he would likely still have been at times in command. Several months before the CFNIS probe, the Prime Minister Harper raised the issue of the relationship in Naples when he met with Vance. At the time, Harper was considering the general for the job. Later, the Conservative government raised concerns about a rumor circulating that Vance, while at CFB Gagetown in New Brunswick, alleged had an inappropriate relationship with a female subordinate. In early 2021, CFNIS launched a new investigation after Major Kelly Brennan told Global News she had a long-term relationship. Vance started at CFB Gagetown and continued in Toronto in 2006. So this is nine years before the Conservatives appointed him, when the general was her superior officer. Vance has not responded to repeated requests for comment from the newspaper when he was told. So it is obvious for anyone who wants to study anything more about General Vance, it is about his appointment in 2015. So we can continue to debate the totally unreasonable and inappropriate motion before us, or we can withdraw the motions and simply get on to learning from victims and witnesses and discuss without reasonable time limits recommendations that we can all agree on to improve the lives of the brave men and women in the Canadian military. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Bagnall. Monsieur Robillard, s'il vous plaît.
Oui, merci, Madame la Présidente.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to begin by reminding everyone of the importance of the motion that has been put forward by Mr. Bagnall, and by thanking him for having done so. I think it's a compromise that will permit us to carry out our work appropriately. 2 minutes, of course, do not suffice for understanding the complex and difficult situation in which members of the Canadian Armed Forces find themselves. 2 minutes. Is this all we can allow for victims, survivors? Sounds ridiculous. Moreover, not requiring of the government a response is all ridiculous. I would like to speak of the review provided us by Dr. Maya Etcher regarding Operation Honor, which made it clear that it takes time to deal with this issue correctly. I quote her, "Military institutions have long based their behaviors on specific notions of what a woman is, what a man is, men being protectors, and women being patriotic mothers. Although the image of the male warrior is still held by many, the roles of men and women have not remained static. Women's presence in military institutions in Western countries has grown considerably over the last 40 years. Many more women are involved in armed forces, and this is due to social and political changes. In particular, there have been changes to recruiting practices and to the claims made by women through the feminist movement, and more recently, changes in the integration rules such as 1325, the ruling of the UN regarding women, peace, and security. Even though women are now more present in military institutions, we see that military institutions continue to privilege men and to marginalize women and values that are associated with femininity. Not all women are affected by negative experiences in the armed forces. Some of them have very good military careers. Nevertheless, the military sector remains an area in which inequality between the sexes remains present. Women play support roles, administrative roles, office roles. In nearly all armies, combat is a privilege reserved for men. Sometimes that's a legislative decision, sometimes it's just by default. And this is a matter that is being challenged as women are asking for the right to integrate the armed forces. There is a good deal of discussion about how women's roles are restricted. Duncanson and Rachel Woodward, 2016, examined the broad issue of redefining gender within military contexts. Pointing to a need to redefine gender to overcome the inequalities currently seen. And these authors mention cultures which co-opt women and insist that we need to think deeply about transforming military cultures that depend on strict definitions of men and women. This is an issue that can be addressed in Canada by addressing the evolution of the culture of the military here in Canada and gender, going back over past decades and examining the limits of Operation Honor. And I will return to this topic later. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Monsieur Robillard.
Chair, thank you very much, and I'd like to welcome colleagues to the discussion this afternoon and thank my colleagues for their earlier interventions so far. I think at the outset, Madam Chair, you reminded us that this meeting has been in session since the 21st of May, some 20 days. We've had very fulsome discussions, debate, not necessarily progress, but certainly debate about how important the issues are before the committee and how they should be tackled. And I think it's incredibly important to keep in mind that testimony is at the forefront of the committee's work. That's why we have these meetings. That's why we have panels. That's why we invite people. And I think it's absolutely critical that we put victims' testimony at the center of our discussion and at the center of the problem. And particularly those victims who have been courageous to come to us directly or who have spoken to other parliamentary committees and who have taken the decision to give their testimony in a public setting. In fact, that's the very starting point of this problem for this committee, is how to empower victims to have the courage, the comfort, the support to come forward. And if they get the perception that for some reason when they come to a parliamentary committee, having taken the step of going into the public realm, to then become a political football, or their testimony becoming some sort of a political football, that immediately will reintroduce a chilling effect on the potential of other victims coming forward in equally sensitive scenarios before other committees. So I think Mr. Bagnall is absolutely spot on when he says this testimony not only needs to be encouraged and supported, but it needs to be put at the very center of our discussion. And I just put that to the committee for consideration. In addition to that, of course, there's expert testimony, of which we have had substantial amounts. There's testimony from officials, including elected officials, the minister himself, high-ranking officials in ministers' offices, high-ranking officials in the Privy Council office. That is incredibly important. Academics as well. And in my submission, also testimony from other jurisdictions that have done this work. So the committee really went through a trajectory of discussion on what was put forward in the minds of some committee members, that there would be additional testimony that should be pursued at all costs. There would be that extra statement that would really close the loop on fundamental questions that, in my view, had already been answered by other witnesses. That chase for an additional witness was ultimately abandoned in favor of an additional argument, which was to hamper the work of the committee as parliamentarians as we normally do it. And in prior interventions, Madam Chair, I made reference to the good work of this committee in the 42nd Parliament on diversity and inclusion in the armed forces, which had a component on sexual misconduct. And in those discussions, there was no dissenting report. In those discussions, there was absolutely not even a question that colleagues would be able to exercise their full parliamentary rights and privileges in those discussions and not be somehow limited artificially to a 2-minute response without having the ability to then follow up or reply or even build on the testimony or questions of colleagues that was put forward previously or subsequently. And in a very important respect, Madam Chair, this proposal would also hamper your ability as chair and as a former serving member of the Canadian Forces, and I'm going to say as a woman, to put your own expertise, your own passion into this subject matter and to guide the discussion as chair of this committee to a fruitful outcome. With the approach of that's been suggested by the opposition, that would not take place in a natural way because it would be artificially truncated by these 2-minute segments. That would be, one intervention only per paragraph or recommendation, I think was the framing of that motion. So it's really important that we have testimony, substantive, primarily from victims, secondarily from experts, policymakers, academics, tertiarily from other jurisdictions, but that we then have a process that allows us to go to work on this subject matter as parliamentarians, as this committee has done in the past, as members of, I think all parties of this committee, or many parties of this committee have done in the 42nd Parliament. We've gone through that experience. We know how it works. We know how productive it can be, and we should really unleash our ability as parliamentarians to the utmost to do that work and to get behind the issue and to get on the same side of the table. With respect to the question before us, again, it has two components. It has the cases of the case of the former Chief of Defence Staff, then followed by another case. But the testimony that is at stake with respect to the circumstance of the former CDS, as Mr. Bagnall has pointed out, that really takes us in good part back to 2015 and even prior to that period. And I think the question that all of us should be interested in across party lines, including members of the Conservative Party, would be how a former Chief of Defence Staff can hold himself out to be so powerful that he would control the Canadian Forces National Investigative Service, that he would own them. And this testimony goes back to a time of 2015 at the time of his appointment. That institutionally and systemically is completely unacceptable and must be unacceptable to all of us, regardless of political affiliation. So this is not a partisan question. This is a question how we change the culture in the Canadian Forces, exemplified by this case, but not limited to this case. There may well be other cases. We certainly have been made aware of other systemic challenges that would prevent additional complainants from coming forward against officers of the Canadian Forces or members of the Canadian Forces of significantly higher rank. That was one of the issues that we were most concerned about, is the asymmetry between senior and junior ranks. I've drawn the committee's attention to work that's been done elsewhere, not to say necessarily that because other jurisdictions are facing the same problem, our jurisdiction Canadian jurisdiction is somehow less significant. The problem is equally significant in all parts of the world that are dealing with it. But because we can use those experiences as an example of the kind of work that we could and should be doing, the tenor of the recommendations, the tenor of the conclusions, and in at least one case, the step of actually having a follow-up exercise within a year of completion of a report on this very same issue. That is information that, in my view, is extremely relevant to the committee, and I've used time before this committee to put it on record, and I will continue to make submissions along those lines. And Madam Chair, at this point, I would like to just simply bring to a close my thoughts on the what I refer to as the Wixton report, which was the report on inappropriate behaviors out of the United Kingdom that took place right around the same time that we really started to get into this issue. It was tabled in 2019, if we look at other jurisdictions, it's roughly that period, 2015 to 2019, where a lot of other militaries were seized with this issue, perhaps not in all cases, or maybe not in any cases, through an instance involving a former chief of defense staff like we had, but certainly with the same recognition of the importance of this issue for women members of the armed forces, but ultimately all members of the armed forces concerned. So Wixton really gave us the impetus to take a look at what could happen if a government gets behind this issue proactively in a very progressive way and with progressive timeframes. And I would like to just put to the committee the concluding portion of that report. And what I'd like to do in later testimony is to just briefly highlight some of the insights from the follow-up that took place a year later, 2020. So if we get it right and we get something out to government and government responds, we can get action maybe quicker than any of us would realize. So Wixton, in its conclusion, stated the following. The report into inappropriate behaviors in defense makes 36 recommendations on what we should do to stop instances of inappropriate behaviors occurring and what we should do better when inappropriate behaviors have occurred. Ultimately, the challenge of inappropriate behavior will only be addressed through a determined effort across the whole force to change the culture, driven persistently from the top and at every level of leadership and line management below that. It requires authentic leadership, relentless engagement, and consistent communication. Everybody has a part to play. We defined inappropriate behaviors as breaches of laws, norms of behavior or core values, and standards which harm or risk harming individuals, teams, or operational effectiveness, and that bring or risk bringing the reputation of individuals, units, the service, or defense into disrepute. We took a consciously broad view of inappropriate behaviors. However, we focused first and foremost on those that harm individuals. We judged that an unacceptable level of inappropriate behavior persists in defense. However, we were unable to quantify it precisely. The evidence reflected in this report indicates a significant number of our people have experienced bullying, discrimination, and harassment, including sexual, but have not felt able or been able to come forward to report it. This pattern mirrored what we identified in other organizations, including the Canadian Armed Forces, the United States military, and the Australian Defence Force. The absence of reporting reflects a deficit of trust in our complaints system. Our own surveys and external stakeholders highlight repeatedly the shortcomings of the current system for raising complaints about inappropriate behavior, with complainants citing a fear of retribution and low confidence or faith that anything would be done or done in a timely manner. We also observe a disproportionate overrepresentation of women and ethnic minorities in the service complaints system and a lack of data on other minority groups. Our recommendations on what should be done to tackle inappropriate behavior focused principally on leadership and line management at every level, setting the right culture and standards, ensuring people meet those standards consistently, and being alert to when standards might slip. We also made recommendations about effective, targeted, and resourced training, a centralized assurance function, the compilation of a single set of data and statistics relating to inappropriate behavior, regular board-level focus on culture and behaviors, and better sharing of leading practice across the three armed forces and civil service. To do better when instances of inappropriate behavior have occurred or are alleged to have occurred, we recommend a review of the service complaints system to include a dedicated central service complaints team equipped to deal with the most complex allegations of bullying, harassment, and discrimination, a helpline for supporting complaints and respondents, as well as a chain of command and line management, and a parallel channel for raising service complaints out with the chain of command, including anonymous and bystander reporting. We also recommended consideration of a two-tier process
Nous avons
to streamline the process for more straightforward cases, enabling staff focus and resources to be aligned to the complexity, sensitivity, and gravity of the complaint. We identified a need for central oversight of cultures and inappropriate behaviors across defense. We recommended the establishment of a defense authority responsible for cultures and inappropriate behaviors. Working to the Chief of Defense People as the senior representative owner, the authority would be responsible for pan-defense strategy, policy, and governance. A single point of reference for all management information, assurance activity across the armed forces, and sharing leading practice across defense. It would also house the Central Service Complaints Team and related helplines and support services. The authority would need to be fully resourced with an estimated 30 to 50 suitably qualified and experienced people, recognizing this will be an additional workforce requirement for defense. Under the subtitle, What Does Good Look Like? The second last paragraph of the conclusion is the following. Tackling inappropriate behavior is about the determination of leaders to change culture. Everything else hangs off that. Real cultural change comes only when leaders communicate and role model those behaviors relentlessly, when there's a clear understanding of what they mean in practice and where there are evident consequences for breaching them. Success might ultimately be judged when matters that arise, as they all by junior leaders or colleagues instinctively and immediately in every part of defense. An inappropriate comment is made, a corporal tells the perpetrator to apologize, why it caused offense. The apology is made and accepted, and the matter resolved. We are already there in many parts of the organization, but changing embedded cultures and driving out inappropriate behavior across the whole of defense will take persistent and concerted effort at every level of leadership and line management over an extended period of time. Finally, we would all recognize that inappropriate behavior and the consequences for the people affected by it damages the United Kingdom Armed Forces' hard-won reputation for courage, determination, and professionalism. We should not, however, lose perspective on the behavior of the overwhelming majority of people in defense who serve with courage, determination, professionalism, and great pride, protecting the UK 24/7. Madam Chair, that's the concluding section of the Wixton report. And as members will have seen through this testimony and other interventions I've made, there is a relevance, there is a level of granularity, there's an openness and acknowledgement of additional gaps that could not be closed. There are also very precise recommendations with respect to resourcing, for example, the Central Defense Authority, with staffing levels being recommended of 30 to 50 in this case. This is the kind of work that was done in the UK under circumstances similar to ours, with the exception of it not, at least I'm not aware of it, not having reached to the highest level of the Chief of Defense Staff, but certainly a jurisdiction, an ally with whom we work very closely through the Five Eyes, through NATO, through the United Nations, through bilateral training exercises, who has not only been seized with the importance of this issue, but also looked to our country in several instances, having catalyzed the debate through the Deschamps report of 2015. The UK has gone forward, has made progress, and I put it to colleagues on this committee that if we get to the same page on this, we can make recommendations of similar impact, similar granularity, relevance, timeliness, and we can really together move the yardsticks on this issue. I think the Canadian public and serving and former members of the Canadian Forces expect nothing less. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'll leave it there. I'll have more interventions later on, but that's it for the moment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Spengeman. On to Mr. Baker, please.
Thanks very much, Madam Chair. And I wanted to follow up on what Mr. Bagnall was speaking to in his remarks. During his remarks, Mr. Bagnall expressed disappointment. I think I'm probably being diplomatic, but expressed disappointment about Mr. Bazan's comments in our committee at the last meeting when Mr. Bazan used the word callous to describe members of the government side who were sharing testimony from another parliamentary committee that was made on the record from survivors of sexual assault and sexual harassment in the armed forces. And during Mr. Bagnall's, when Mr. Bagnall expressed that concern, Mr. Bazan called that a rant. I thought that was completely inappropriate. Mr. Bazan thought it appropriate to use time in his testimony at the last meeting to criticize members of this side, and as disappointing as it was to hear Mr. Bazan say that, none of us interrupted him and none of us called it a rant. So I wanted to object to that type of interruption of Mr. Bagnall earlier in the meeting, Madam Chair. I also wanted to say that it wasn't just in the last meeting that Mr. Bazan shared this point of view. To be frank, I would have expected that he would have reconsidered his point of view after the last meeting, after he'd heard from some of the members of the government side who responded to his intervention, suggesting that sharing survivor testimony that's on the record from the Status of Women Committee is when Mr. Bazan called it callous. I thought he'd reconsider that position. And I guess he didn't, or he felt even more strongly about his position because Mr. Bazan decided to deliver a member statement in the House of Commons where he said, and I quote, they are referring to government members of the committee, quote, they are disrespectfully and unfairly quoting survivors of military sexual misconduct. What is disrespectful and unfair about sharing the testimony of survivors that has been made before a parliamentary committee on the record? I've been thinking about this the last couple of days since I've heard these words in the House of Commons, and I cannot get my head around it. These survivors are the people who we should be trying to help. They should be at the center of what we're doing in this committee. They should be our focus. And success, to me, is only if we, as a committee, do everything we can to help these folks. Anything short of that is not success. Anything short of that is failure. And so these are the people who we should be trying to help, and these are the people whose voices we should most want to hear. Their perspective, their expertise is what we should be focusing on and giving the most weight to. Not just because they're the victims in this, but because they know so much about this. And they've thought about it and they've discussed it with people and they're experts and they know how to fix the problem. These are the people whose voices we should most want to hear. And that's why members of the government side are sharing their testimony. We're giving them voice. We're amplifying their message. What's to me disrespectful and unfair is not to listen to that message, not to try to understand, not to make it a priority. And what's beyond disrespectful and unfair is to try to silence those voices in any way, shape, or form. And Mr. Bazan has tried to do that twice on the record. And to me, what that shows is that Mr. Bazan has a very different set of priorities. That he's not interested in solving this problem. Because if he was, it's when government members or any member was sharing that testimony that he would be listening the most intently, that he would be the most interested. Maybe he'd share some of that testimony himself, or at least reflect on it. But instead, the platform in this committee and then the platform for sharing the perspective of survivors. So I I find that beyond disappointing. I find it beyond reprehensible. And I completely agree with what Mr. Bagnall was saying. And I think it underlines the problem in this committee. It underlines why we have a motion from Mr. Bazan before us, which is designed to produce a document that does nothing to help survivors. That's why there's no, in the motion, there's going to be 2 minutes of debate and we move on. For each member, 2 minutes for each member, and then we move on. And that's why there's no consensus that would be required under Mr. Bazan's motion in delivery of the report, as there is with every other report that's produced by a committee in the House of Commons, because Mr. Bazan just wants to ram it through and doesn't want to deal with these challenging issues, clearly. The only way to get to a report that helps survivors is to build consensus. It's to work together. It's to listen to survivors, first of all. That goes without saying, I would have thought. But certainly after having done that, it means sitting down together as a committee and wrestling with our differences of opinion and finding that consensus. And then after we find that consensus around what the problems are, it's coming to consensus on the solutions and then making recommendations and then putting that before the government and urging the government, insisting on the government acting on those. That's the purpose of this committee. Every committee is to make change for the positive. And the issue before us that we need to make change on is what is happening in the armed forces and the sexual assault and sexual misconduct that we've heard about. And it's helping the survivors. That should be the focus of this report. And so Mr. Bazan's motion prevents us from doing that, because we can't debate these complex issues. We can't come to consensus on these complex issues. And then wants to basically decide which clauses go in and out, which clauses stay and which clauses are for us to quote survivors of military sexual misconduct. Mr. Bazan's motion is disrespectful and unfair to those survivors. That's what's disrespectful and unfair. Because all it would be a report that doesn't take on and solve the challenges facing survivors, facing the Canadian Armed Forces. But Mr. Bazan could hold it up and say, see, we produced a report that's absolutely useless to solving the problem that we should be solving. And so the reason I and others are sharing what survivors are telling us is because we're trying to remind the members of this committee what we should be focused on and what needs to be in that report, and why Mr. Bazan's motion would prevent us from issuing a report that helps survivors. In fact, issuing a report the way Mr. Bazan proposed would be harmful in my view, because it would claim to be a report that addresses the issues of sexual harassment, sexual assault in the military, but it wouldn't. Because Mr. Bazan doesn't want to discuss them. He doesn't want to deal with the nuance. He doesn't want to deal with the complexity. He just wants to be a document and move on. Like, that would be disrespectful and unfair. So that's why we're sharing, and that's why I'm going to continue to share. One of the folks who presented to the Standing Committee on the Status of Women, whose perspective I think is important to hear from and to take heed of, is Ms. MJ Batek. I want to share with you some of what Ms. Batek shared with our colleagues. She says, I'm here as a veteran military sexual trauma survivor, a military domestic violence survivor, and as a representative of the Survivor Perspectives Consulting Group, also referred to as SPCG. SPCG was recently created by a small group of military sexual trauma survivors. For decades, we have watched in silence and have now come together to take action, to ensure survivor voices are heard, and to create solutions, to help combat this crisis. Just as the Government of Canada uses gender-based analysis plus, which goes beyond sex and gender to other intersecting identity factors, such as race, ethnicity, or age, the Canadian Armed Forces should consider the perspective of military sexual trauma survivors at every stage of strategy and policy development. We at SPCG are willing to work towards the provision of that perspective in a professionally coordinated format. We do not propose to have all of the answers, as we are not organizational culture or military justice experts. But we are the unfortunate experts by experience of military sexual trauma. So this is what I was referring to. I'm going to pause here. This is what I was referring to a few moments ago. Here you have somebody who's a survivor, who has experience, who's working together with others survivors to identify solutions to the problem, to help us, as she says, combat this crisis, to create solutions to combat this crisis. Those are her words. And there's 2 points I want to make about the initial part of her testimony. First of all, these are the kinds of people we need to be hearing from. These are the kinds of people who are not only survivors, and whose perspectives we should be focused on intently and listening to and learning from, but these are also experts. So that's the first thing. The second point is, even though Ms. Batek is a survivor and really knowledgeable, and has worked hard with others to become really knowledgeable about what the solutions could be, or to develop those solutions, I should say, even she is admitting, she's saying, and I quote again, "We do not propose to have all of the answers, as we are not organizational culture or military justice experts. We are the unfortunate experts by experience of military sexual trauma." So by any measure, I think we could all agree Ms. Batek is an expert. But even she is saying she's an expert. She's not an expert in all aspects of solving this problem. So if the experts acknowledge that we need other experts to help with components of the problem, surely we need help. We need all of their help to solve this problem, right? Surely we need to hear from all of them, and we need to incorporate all of that in a report to the extent that we have heard from them. And she speaks specifically about we are not organizational culture or military justice experts. Like, how many times have we heard about culture and spoken about culture at this committee, and how difficult that is, how much change is needed in the armed forces? I think we've heard that from expert after expert who's presented to this committee about how changes in culture are needed in the armed forces desperately, and how difficult that is to implement in any organization, and especially one as large as the armed forces, and as hierarchical as the armed forces. And many members in the committee have spoken about this in our discussions. Mr. Bagnall especially continues to highlight the importance of culture change to solve this problem. My point one of my points is, we need to hear from Ms. Batek and others like her, and we need to make sure that knowledge and expertise is brought into this report, but also heed her warning that there are other people we need to turn to for expertise on military justice and on organizational culture. And all of that has to make it into the report. But for that to happen, we need more than 2 minutes of debate each, or discussion each. I mean, it's taking me more than 2 minutes just to explain why Ms. Batek's testimony is so important and why we need to hear from these experts. It'll take us time. It'll take hard work to convey and debate and find consensus around what we actually want to recommend as a committee, which is why Mr. Bazan's motion is so dangerous and disrespectful to survivors, in my view. I'd like to go on and reading on from the testimony that Ms. Batek provided to the Status of Women Committee. We can help define the problem, the full extent of which is still unknown. We can point to specific gaps, deficiencies, and issues. We know, for example, that the internal reporting mechanism is flawed and that independent oversight is badly needed. We can help find and develop solutions, immediate, medium, and long-term solutions, because we have ideas. We have ideas that can be developed into plans, policies, and programs. For example, we have developed a one-day workshop that can be used in the immediate term to help kickstart the culture shift that is desperately needed throughout the organization. This training package, called the Frontline Workshop, is survivor-born and is based on civilian best practices created specifically for the Canadian Armed Forces. The Frontline Workshop will challenge and confront the social norms and unconscious biases of the attendees. It will shake their foundation and open their minds unlike anything the military has done before. We can provide feedback on and input into strategies, plans, and policies every step of the way during development, implementation, and monitoring stages. Okay, so I want to pause there in Ms. Batek's testimony. And do we not, I mean, Ms. Batek and her colleagues are proposing a solution to part of the problem. They're proposing to offer their help to solve the problem, like in a concrete, tangible way. Is this committee going to recommend that? Is this committee going to consider that? I mean, clearly not if Mr. Bazan had his way, because Mr. Bazan doesn't want to even hear from Ms. Batek. But even if he did hear from Ms. Batek, even if we all listened to what Ms. Batek had to say, which is why I'm sharing what she had to say, would we ask her and her colleagues to implement the solution they're offering to the Canadian Armed Forces? Would we recommend that the government implement it? We don't know. And the reason we don't know is because some members of this committee don't want to take the time to know. They want to tick the box, say they wrote a report that does nothing for survivors. It's beyond belief, really. They're offering a frontline workshop that will challenge and confront the social norms and unconscious biases of the attendees, something we've heard about over and over again from people who tried to underline or explain why this problem of sexual harassment and assault in the military exists. They're offering to help us solve that problem. And we're going to refuse to have an opinion on it, or we're going to put ourselves in a position where we can't consider it because we can only spend 2 minutes each talking, and, you know. And some members of the opposition just want to move on to other things, and they want to have a big debate in the House of Commons without actually considering what Ms. Batek has to say or what she has to offer or the impact she could have on solving this problem. I don't understand why our priority is moving on from this report in a way that's not helpful to survivors so that we can have a debate in the House of Commons. What we need right now, we can have debates in the House of Commons, and we should, and we can continue to do that in the years to come, months and years to come. I'm happy to have those debates, happy to participate in those debates. But we are MPs. We're not the experts. The experts are talking to us. We should listen to them. And we should think about what they've said and thoughtfully review it together and come to consensus together like we do for every other report we ever write. And then we should do what Mr. Bagnall is proposing in his amendment or sub-amendment, is make sure that the government actually responds. Because the only way to make sure that our committee has any impact is to make sure that we not only write a thoughtful report, but that government's accountable for responding and tackling those challenges. And we and others can hold government to account for doing what they said they would do in their response. But Mr. Bazan doesn't want to respond. He doesn't want to hold the government accountable for solving this problem. And the only reason I can imagine why is because he doesn't want to actually solve the problem. but he wants to have his debate in the House of Commons. So he can grab some headlines and play some politics. Like, that's not why I'm here. That's not why I ran for office. And I think the survivors expect and deserve better. Ms. Batek goes on to say, just like any GBA plus analysis of various identity factors, we want to provide the military sexual trauma survivor perspective with potential solutions to the Canadian Armed Forces as a professional voice, as well as to other stakeholders, such as Veterans Affairs Canada. We're currently in the building phase of our organization, but we are aiming to represent multiple identity factors, including men, Indigenous, veteran, LGBTQ+, and civilian survivors, among others, as this is not specifically a women's issue. Yes, I did say civilian survivors, because it is important to note that the impact of a sexualized military culture is not limited to members of the military. The impact reaches beyond the perimeter of the workplace and negatively affects the lives of military families, spouses, and children, as well as the community at large. I want to pause there on that point. Ms. Batek is flagging for us that this problem extends beyond how many people, where many people think it extends to. She's talking about civilian survivors. She's talking about other groups of people who are impacted. I think we need to hear that. And I think we need to listen. And then we need to write a thoughtful report that takes into account Ms. Batek's testimony and the testimony of other survivors and experts and the others we've heard from. All of them. And I know it's hard. I know it's going to be hard work. I know it's going to require a lot of consensus building, but we got to do it, because that's how we can get to a report that makes a difference, or that has recommendations to government that can make a difference. And we need Mr. Bagnall's amendment to pass, because we need government to be accountable for implementing those things. Because if government implements those things that we recommend, then we can help. We are helping to address the problem of sexual assault and sexual misconduct in the military. So I say we listen to survivors. I say we write a report that's thoughtful, that allows us to come to consensus, that obtains a government response, and that demands government actions, because I think survivors deserve no less. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Baker. On to Mr. Bagnall, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Obviously, we're at an impasse that stops us getting forward with recommendations that can help the military and help survivors, because at the moment the opposition refuses to withdraw a motion that would lead to an unreasonable report. Now, I proposed a possible way forward. I didn't put in an amendment yet, but it was a compromise, whereas we could actually get some recommendations to help military, to help future men and women that want to go into the military, and so that the survivors have been heard. And my solution roughly was that we go through all recommendations from all parties, see which ones we could unanimously agree to use Mr. Bazan's process on, and get those recommendations forward, and then deal with the more difficult ones at the end. So I haven't heard any objections from the opposition parties, so I assume they're still discussing it. So we'll have to wait. The committee will have to wait before we can go forward until we see a response. What I really wanted to do today, because the particular motion doesn't allow us to debate recommendations other than the 2 minutes, which, as the previous speaker mentioned, is totally inappropriate for a number of very serious recommendations. I wanted to propose some major recommendations today, and then those committees that are interested can help me word them, reword them, object to them, and we could have a debate on each of those. But that will have to wait to do that because I want to, before doing that, I want to, as I've said earlier today and before, and at time and time again, that, and the previous speaker just mentioned it as well, that the serious recommendations we made should be based upon what the witnesses told us and what the experts have told us. And so the recommendations that I will come up with for our discussions at subsequent meetings are based on the testimony of those experts and witnesses, which is what all committees do. They hear witnesses, and then that's what's in the report, what the witnesses said, and what's recommended. So I just wanted to go into some of that witness expert testimony from elsewhere because it leads to the recommendations that I'm going to make later on, some of the recommendations. So Ms. Lalonde said, I can tell you that the highest rate of post-traumatic stress disorder worldwide is among victims of rape and sexual violence. The second highest rate is in the military. We urgently need to take this seriously. Trauma shouldn't be organized into a hierarchy. When the trauma isn't considered equivalent to trauma caused by war, victims of sexual violence don't receive the support that they deserve. That's unacceptable. So later on, I'll be making a recommendation related to our report, related exactly to that, this type of trauma has to be treated equally with other types of trauma. There was another question, how important is it that this is constantly evolving way of finding solutions? How important is it that this is constantly an evolving process? And Dr. Okros said, first of all, definitely agree that it is important. And I definitely agree with the fact it's evolving. One of the challenges of Operation Honor was that there was an end state. There is no end state to the way in which Canadian society is continuing to evolve, and therefore how the Canadian Armed Forces has to continually evolve. So I think these are going to be valuable and required processes going forward. The other comment that I would make is that while there are efforts to reach out again, I would go back to, we need to understand the consequences of military sexual trauma. We need to understand that there's still individuals that are not able or willing or in a position to come forward and speak. And I think part of this needs to be reaching out to organizations and colleagues that they are willing to talk to have individuals bring their voices forward. And I think we've heard that before in some other testimony from high-ranking military members, that there are more stories to come, and that they just haven't been able to, under the circumstances, bring them forward yet. And that's the type of recommendations that we should be looking at on how it can be appropriate for them to bring it forward and easy and not have reprisals. Just going on with the quote, last quick one that I'll make is we need to be very, very careful about people speaking for others. I cannot speak for members of the armed forces, and I definitely cannot speak for women. And I think we have concerns when people choose to speak for other groups. So that's why it's very important that we hear the direct testimony of victims and people that are involved on the ground that can suggest, outline the horrific situations they've been in, which I still, I think over and over again, if that happened to me, I have no idea how I could handle that. And people cannot denigrate the gravity of those instances over a lifetime. So then there was, it went on to talk about power imbalance. And the question was, in what ways do we need to address that in order to be able to get to the point where we're preventing all this kind of behavior in the first place? And I think in the quote I gave earlier from the debate in the House of Commons on Wednesday night, I mentioned a quote related to that earlier in this meeting. I mentioned a quote related to power imbalance. And Dr. Akro said, this is part of self-insight and self-understanding. And I think the more that we can do to facilitate people, and I will say that I am the best representative on the screen, and old white men like me in particular need to really open up our eyes and start learning. But we also need to look at customs and practices that reinforce these things. A simple example is visible in this committee. That was the committee he was speaking to. Speaking, order, and length of time for questions signals a power hierarchy. And we need to be thinking about what is the message sent about who is the least important person on the screen right now. And what are the ways we can level those, that we can address those, that we can make sure that those who perceive they're the least important are still empowered to speak up and speak out. It's complex. All organizations, all institutions practice it. It requires open communications, and the most critical thing I go back to, it needs those who have got the weakest voice to be able to be heard the most. And I'm sure that, as you know from testimony we've heard, that that's simply not the case at the moment. And it should give us all food for thought. And there's no easy solutions. I don't know what all the solutions are, and that's why we need to debate more than 2 minutes a recommendation, very serious recommendations, and try and come to the best conclusions on those recommendations. On the urgency of taking action now, Dr. Akro said, this is urgent. We have people who are still hurting. We have members internally within the military. It's been stated that they have lost trust. That needs to be rebuilt with urgency. When Canadians need to have confidence in their military and need to have confidence that when particularly young women and young men and people of diverse identities choose to serve in Canada in uniform, that they're going to be treated with respect and they're going to have good, full meaning, full career. That needs to be something that needs to be communicated effectively. And Christine Wood went on after that on getting to action. I can tell you the things that you have heard before. Victims need support. There are more and more coming forward, and there's still no safety net to catch them. These individuals are not coming forward to report a simple discrepancy they saw in paperwork. They're coming forward with their experiences of terror, debilitating anxiety, and shredded self-confidences. They're broken. It's simply unethical to continue to ask them to come forward without having a plan in place to support them. So to be clear, we are asking for the same supports that we were asking for 4 years ago, and that is a national platform for online peer support, group therapy, outpatient therapy, and inpatient psychiatric care when necessary. That is MST specific in its focus. It needs to be trauma informed. It needs to be able to address the moral injury of betrayal for your brothers and sisters in uniforms. And that's why in my recommendations that I'll be bringing forward later for extensive debate, we have to talk about that peer support that has just been recommended there. Now, if the committee brings forward some recommendations that would help survivors, if the opposition lets us get by this impasse, if we can bring forward recommendations, we need to, people want to have confidence that they will be implemented. So that's why, of course, my amendment to the motion that we should have a reply that the government is going to be implementing them. There was a suggestion, I know, there was a suggestion that there's a loss of trust and that needs to be overcome. Um, and obviously, there have been certain senior leaders in the military presently under investigation, and we'll let that run its course. But in reference to the minister, and I know Mr. Bazan has been criticized a lot today, but this is not something he brought up. This was another committee member. But I would say if the committee members that are interested in progress, when has there been a minister that is so open to the progress? And I mentioned, for if there's media watching that weren't on all the previous committee members, I spoke close to an hour of the things that have been done by this government and under this minister. And that's a good record that people can go to in case someone says that things have not been done. But obviously the minister is the first to admit, and as our committee and the number of incidences that myself and Mr. Garrison have outlined show, there's a lot more that needs to be done. And that's what the things we should be discussing. So just to ensure you that the government is open to respond, as if there's some suggestions, there's no response because they won't. As Mr. Baker said earlier today, one of the big items, the three big items that really need recommendations, the first of the three is culture change. And to show you that the ministers is open to culture change, is open, just as he said, anything is on the table. He's just waiting for us to move ahead as a committee and make recommendations on what needs to. Well, he's not actually waiting because we're stalled. He's gone ahead and made some major appointments, including Madame Arbour. And with or without us, he's moving ahead, and we will certainly get our recommendations to him. I will, one way or another. But just to show you that he's open, I'm just going to quote him for anyone that suggests there's a lack of openness from the minister to listening to our recommendations for change, because change is, as everyone knows, is often difficult. But we could spend a whole committee on the quotes of how he's willing to look at what we're proposing, what victims are proposing, what experts are proposing to try and deal with the difficult situation that plagues not only our military, but militaries around the world. And of course, culture is important because, you can't blame individual members totally if they're in a culture where that's acceptable, we're social animals. And so we have to improve that culture. And so to show the minister's open to change, I'll just go through some comments that he made. He said, culture change is something that we're all committed to. And I believe in this. In the committee here, there's some wonderful recommendations. This was the other committee. There's some wonderful recommendations that can be provided, but also looking at the changes that need to be made. What we need to make sure is that we just don't look at a report or look at recommendations and sign off on this and think that it's done. I can, for example, list off a whole bunch of things ultimately, but what I'm looking for is what results we are creating on the ground. And that's very insightful by the minister, because I've mentioned it at earlier meetings, is that not only was there roughly an hour of things I outlined that have been done, including an updated of an administrative procedure that I thought was much better than the previous one. But obviously, as the minister has just said, and what I quoted, they're not all working, that you can't just make the recommendation. You've got to have the appropriate follow-up. So he went on, I can, for example, list off a whole bunch of things, but ultimately, what I'm always looking for is what results are we creating on the ground? When somebody is joining, are they in basic training, creating and having a safe environment? And again, that's very perceptive because, as was mentioned before, there was an incident on basic training. A recommendation was this needed to be incorporated, related to sexual misconduct and appropriate behavior, and yet the trainer was besieged by laughs and ridicule by the people taking the training because that was the particular culture. So it can't just be the recommendation, as the minister says. There has to be the follow-up. So creating a safe environment is if something comes up, I'm quoting the minister again, whether it's a religious complication, whether it's a gender issue, LGBTQ2 rights, or anything that we can immediately address, it's because employment equity actually states that we must. Do we have the right action groups? Do we have the right governance structure? This is what the panel on independent systemic racism, gender bias, and LGBTQ rights is currently doing, looking at where we are at on those issues, to dig deep inside the Canadian Armed Forces, look at what are the changes that are needed. Again, as you can see, the minister is open to change and already has taken the significant action. So that's the type of champion we need to bring our recommendations forward. As the minister goes on, as I talk about numbers, and right now, those are the metrics that we want to judge by ourselves. But you know what? That's progress. That's not success. Going from 6 to 14 general officers is important. But the pipeline, when you look at the other lower below that, when you create a greater pipeline, it can never be stopped. Why was it that women, we had a representation of women? The percentages were obviously nothing to be proud of. But why didn't we have, which was 15% women in the past, why didn't we have 50% women before? One of the goals that I wanted to do is immediately start looking at making those changes. That when somebody had a complaint, it could be immediately, they can come forward regardless of retribution, something that when I sign off on any type of general officers, the question that I ask, I don't look at what their ability to command is. I trust that they can do that. The question I ask is this person that can actually bring a leader that can bring in culture change? Because if that's not, we don't want them to be promoted, but if they do, we want to give them proper resources to do so. So this, again, the minister's almost ahead of us here in making these suggested changes, because that was going to be one of the recommendations that I've referred to is needed, and parliamentary secretary has referred to, I think, and that's what is taken into consideration during promotion. Obviously, it has to be looked at in our recommendations, in our systems. So the minister goes on. We also need to make sure that we have senior women at the table so we have proper representation. This is not the be all and end all, but what it does is making sure that we have the right people to put the right structures in place. We need to look at how the independence of the investigations are conducted. And of course, I mentioned a potential question about that earlier related to General Vance's appointment. And of course, survivors have brought up the issue, the second big issue, which I'm not going to address right now, but that's the chain of command involvement related to investigations. Minister goes on, we need to take a look at, do we have the right resources in place so that people are supported? And in the testimony of the experts that I just read a few minutes ago, and that was one of the points that they raised as well. And the minister is right on that. And then one question that what I'm having our answer is, if somebody does something in their past, would it be acceptable for them to join the Canadian Armed Forces? If someone does something inside the Canadian Armed Forces, why can't we get them out sooner? So the minister's already looking at all these questions, and he is obviously moving forward, looking at very important considerations. But we could add to that. We've done a lot of time on studying and hearing experts and witnesses, and we could actually add to that if people would cooperate and come together on the things that we can at least agree on together. Obviously, some things we won't agree on. The minister goes on, those also have to go through a proper legal checks and balances, because ultimately, I can't make that a decision on that. That's the law. We have to follow the law, and if changes need to be made, we go through the parliamentary process to get those laws changed so we can create the proper changes. But ultimately, all of us, including this committee, and I look forward to the recommendations. We need to be able to do the ripple effect of any recommendations to see how we can actually have that impact, because too often in the past, what we have done, where we made some, changes, but they've actually didn't achieve the outcome that we want. And when I became minister, that was the last thing I wanted, was to give out these speeches. I wanted to be focused on the metrics themselves, the changes that we're making. And that's so, from my perspective, insightful from the minister. And we often don't hear enough, is that it's the measurement of the outcomes that are important. And certainly we can consider that if we're allowed to have a serious discussion on recommendations. The minister goes on, I know we've made progress and we're proud of that progress, but obviously not only this is not enough. And as I said earlier, the minister has said that many times. Yes, I'm deeply hurt that we couldn't move forward. I wish we had a magic wand to be able to make this all go away, but we're not. But at the same time, I didn't quit before when I was serving to support the people. I'm not going to quit now. I'm committed to Canadian Armed Forces to make sure that we create an inclusive environment. And you heard earlier in his statement about ways he's already working on that, because there are people inside in Canada right now who want to serve their country, but they deserve to have harassment-free workplace so they can reach their true potential. And we're not going to stop until we achieve that, regardless of how long it takes. So you can see that there's no question that minister and government are not ready to respond. They're not ready to they're ready to take our recommendations seriously. He said previously, everything's on the table. And that's why I have said over and over that we should get onto these serious recommendations that would help survivors based on the testimony we've heard from survivors and from the experts, which I hope to hear some more of, so I can refine the recommendations that I want to have a lengthy discussion at this meeting or subsequent meetings. So I will leave it at that for now. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Bagnall. On to Madame Vandenbel, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I want to thank my colleagues for their thoughtful interventions today. I am still disappointed that we are continuing to debate motion after motion. The opposition knows, and they're continuing to rebuff any efforts to either withdraw this motion or adjourn the debate, or even allow us to adjourn this meeting, knowing we would then be able to get directly to the reports. And I am disappointed that all three opposition parties have rebuffed good faith efforts to see if we can get past this impasse. And I was particularly disturbed earlier when Mr. Bagnall was giving a proposal that I believe to be very sincere, to see how we can get past this impasse, at least in part. And he was being laughed at and scoffed at by members of the opposition here in the room. And it's one thing for us to disagree but it's another to just laugh at each other. I really think that we're above that, and I do believe that Mr. Bagnall was sincere in what he was proposing, as have I been in various proposals that I brought to all three opposition parties and that other members of the committee have discussed. And I know that at this point, one of the best things we can do is to make sure, regardless of what happens in terms of the reports, particularly when you have motions that say no government response. I'm very grateful to Mr. Bagnall for bringing an amendment that says that we do need a government response, because what is the reason then that we are here, that we are putting a report to Parliament if it's not to have the government respond to that report and take action on it? So I'm still very, I'm hopeful, but I'm also very disappointed that there does not seem to be any good faith willingness to try to get beyond this impasse. So having said that, Madam Chair, I'd like to continue where I left off last time about some of the very important recommendations that some of our witnesses and survivors and academics and experts have actually brought here to our committee and to the FIWO committee and to us as members of Parliament, because I believe that these are vitally important recommendations. I am very glad to hear my colleagues talk about the importance of making sure that we are amplifying the voices of survivors, of experts. We heard from academics who have spent their entire academic career looking at these kinds of issues and have solutions. And Madam Chair, we've heard a lot of recommendations. We've heard a lot of solutions. And so I'd like to continue to put on record and amplify some of those voices and some of those recommendations. So as those who have been watching this meeting previously will recall, I've been going through a list of various recommendations that we have compiled based on the testimony and what we have heard from survivors. This is the section here that we've compiled them into something called Culture Change in the Canadian Armed Forces. And so I will begin where I left off. The next recommendation here is about addressing the generalized lack of expertise on sexual misconduct, culture change, or gender issues in the Canadian Armed Forces. And I think it's interesting that the survivors would put that forward in particular, because lack of expertise. I think that this can mean many things. First of all, I do believe that there is increasingly more and more expertise on this issue. There's, of course, within the SMRC, which is on the departmental side, developing not just expertise in terms of the people, but also in terms of the data that they're collecting, in terms of the combined knowledge, the knowledge creation that comes from lived experience. And so I do believe that there is certainly on both sides and also within the Canadian Armed Forces, because of the training that we have put in place, there is more and more expertise. But I think that when the survivors put this particular recommendation forward, I think it was more to talk about the gaps. And we know that somebody who is trained to be a soldier, a sailor, an aviator, somebody whose main job every day is to protect Canadians and to and they're very, very specialized and very trained, does not mean that they would necessarily be able to have the in-depth level of expertise that one needs to be able to provide advice, particularly when it comes to institutional culture change. Because culture change is not easy, especially when it's dependent on self-reflection. I've worked around the world on institutions around the world with UN Women and other global institutions about culture change. And it is something that requires a set of eyes that is coming from outside, simply because of the fact that it is the culture. It is something you're unaware of. When you're in a particular institutional culture, it can be very difficult to recognize sometimes the things that make up that culture because they become self-evident. It's certain paradigms that everybody shares. And unless somebody is directly confronted with something that they consider self-evident and asked, why they have that belief, why they hold that particular notion, and then has to reflect on it, that particular culture and that paradigm isn't going to change. And so that is what requires the outside expertise. And I do believe that this is expertise on a number of levels. This would, of course, be people who are subject matter experts in issues of sexual misconduct, trauma-informed experts, those that understand how to investigate. We need experts on essentially how do you respond to these issues. But we also need experts on culture change, experts on institutional culture, on processes, procedures. So I think it is really telling that the survivors themselves are asking for that to come from outside of the Canadian Armed Forces, in some ways to put up a mirror, to be able to show what it looks like to somebody who is not already embedded in it. And, you know, honestly, to somebody who isn't invested in things staying the same. Because we all know, many of us know, that once you're in an institution, and of course you believe in that institution fundamentally, which is why it's such a betrayal when that institution fails you, because those who are in the Canadian Armed Forces, by their nature, believe in what they're doing, believe in the institution. And so this is why it's very hard to be self-reflective and to look at the flaws within that. So I think this recommendation is particularly important, and certainly something that would be worthy of putting in a report. Another recommendation, the next one, recommends acknowledging that CAF's current approach of self-monitoring is too reactive, inconsistent, linear, and simplistic to be effective and successful against the complex problem of sexual violence. And I think that these words that were chosen by survivors and witnesses, these words are very, very telling and very important. First of all, the approach of self-monitoring, being too reactive. And I think that is sadly something that we have seen, that instead of looking proactively, instead of preventing, instead of taking actions before there is a significant crisis or a significant problem, I do believe that it's been recognized. It's certainly been recognized by the acting chief, by the minister, I myself, and many others, that it is something that has been reactive, and I think that it needs to be something that you do before it reaches crisis. So that's very, very important. The approach to self-monitoring should not be reactive. But then the next one is even more important: inconsistent. That the CAF's current approach is inconsistent. This is something that we've seen in the testimony. We certainly saw the differences in the way that men and women who commit almost the exact same or even the exact same offense are treated differently. Or that sometimes if you happen to have a chain of command, that your particular chain of command and the resources and things that you have available to you would allow for things to be resolved in an equitable and just way, there are just outcomes. But for others, and I think this is why Justice Fish's recommendation that the chain of command be taken out of the investigation when there are military investigations, military police, CFNIS investigations, that it shouldn't rely on that chain of command, particularly if the chain of command is where the problem is, if that's where the harassment is occurring. Very, very important that be done independently. And the reason that it has to be independent is because of this inconsistency. And the one thing that is required and necessary for people to feel that they have trust in an institution, for people to feel that it will be fair to them, whether it is a victim, a perpetrator, whether it is a serious misconduct issue or something like a joke, or which is also very, very serious. But no matter what it is the consistency in the response. If people know that regardless of who brings it up, regardless of the rank or position of the person who's perpetrating, regardless of where they are in the chain of command, regardless of what their their role, that they will have consistent application of the policies, the procedures, the values, the processes in order to get a just outcome. And in fact, Madam Chair, I would say that a just outcome is defined by the fact that it is consistent, and not dependent on who happens to be in your unit or who your chain of command is or who you are. The next one, I will be honest, I'm not entirely certain what it means, and I think we would need to do a little bit more reflection and thinking on it, is the choice of the word linear. That the survivors have put this forward, saying that CAF's current approach of self-monitoring is too linear. And I think, and this is just my own interpretation, I think what they're saying when they say that it's too linear is that it is an action and then a consequence, and then it just goes in a straight line, as opposed to looking at the full context, looking 360, making sure that we're not just looking at A equals B equals C, but actually looking at everything around so that we can actually change the culture. But I'm actually not certain. So I think that's an area that certainly we could delve into a little bit more. The next one I think is a little bit more obvious, and that is the choice of the word simplistic. That the CAF's current approach of self-monitoring is simplistic. And I think that's something that it's an easy trap to fall into. We have seen that this is a complex issue. We have seen in the beginning, when we started our study, which I'll remind members was supposed to be 3 days and has gone on for about 4 months. But when we started this study, I think most of us thought we understood. Most of us thought that we had a bit of a handle on it. We knew that bad things had happened, and we thought we knew how they should be fixed. But the more that we delve into it, the more we heard from witnesses, the more that we heard from the academics and from members of CAF, from people who are actually part of the process, I think we learned how complex it is. And this is why the motion and the amendment, the motion before us that says we can only spend 2 minutes each discussing these recommendations, I think that's exactly why that doesn't work, because it isn't simplistic. It is a very nuanced, very complicated. Even the solutions are complicated. We've heard so many proposals from very, very credible witnesses. And these proposals have been, in some cases, complementary to one another, but in other cases, they've been contradictory. There are those who propose solutions who say that we need to put everything into one. We need to take the SMRC, the ombudsperson, an inspector general type of office, and put it all in one place. And then there's others who say, if you have the investigative arm, which are investigating perpetrators, in the same place as the support for the survivors, the advocates, the counseling, the policy, the data, that there needs to be some kind of a division there, because otherwise you have the very same people counseling survivors and doing the persecution, the investigation at the same time, and providing whatever supports or processes for the people who are conducting this bad behavior. We've heard that. We've heard a number of different solutions, in what ways it should report to Parliament, in what ways, what does independent mean? We know with the Deschamps report in 2015, when that went to the highest levels of CAF, the definition of independence to CAF was that it be outside CAF, that it be outside the Canadian Armed Forces, outside of the chain of command. And that then by putting it under the Department of National Defense, the civilian side of National Defense, who are not in the actual chain of command because they're not actually military members. Often many of them are ex-military, but by putting it there, that was seen by many to be considered independent. We know now it didn't work. We know now that that's not independent enough. We've heard from so many of the witnesses that it wasn't working for them, that putting it under D&D was not necessarily what Madame Deschamps would have intended, but for many people that was the interpretation. And so I think that now that we know this, it also shows, by the way, why it is so important that we have Madame Arbour, because Madame Deschamps did a very effective job of identifying the problem and identifying what needed to be done. There needs to be an independent body, but actually getting from the what to the how, actually putting together a roadmap, specifics of exactly how to do this. If you ask 25 of the people that came before us, you could probably get as many as 25 solutions about how you actually put that in place. And that's the piece that's the hardest. And we all know that. In our own lives, we know that we often know what we need to do. But how do we do it? What is the first step? What does it look like at the end? What are the unintended consequences? This particular file is full of unintended consequences. Operation Honor had unintended consequences. I believe that those who initially established Operation Honor did so in good faith and believed that the impact of it would have the results. And we now see that many of the things in Operation Honor did not have the intended impact or results. And what we've seen actually is that certain things were harmful. We know that, for instance, things like the duty to report has taken away agency of individual victims, individual survivors, people who go through certain kinds of behavior and then perhaps are not either ready to go forward with a full-out investigation or chose to try to do it in a different way. And we know that sometimes certain things, it's better to make sure that the people who've experienced it have the agency and are able to control how and when these things come forward. In many cases, informing the perpetrator that somebody has complained is perhaps the thing that the person fears most. But because of duty to report, that has happened. And it may happen before someone feels ready. It could be that with the right supports, with the right options placed before them, with the right understanding of process, with the right advocates beside them, that people would want to come forward and go through a full investigation and be able to confront that person and see that person comes to justice. But to the duty to report took that away. It forced people into that before they were ready or when they specifically didn't want to. And I think that it's very hard because one of the things that we see is that bystanders are very important, that people who see wrong need to call it out. And so it is a really hard thing to know when is somebody calling out somebody else. We call it in certain other areas of feminism, the white knight syndrome. And I think most of us as women have had those circumstances where a very well-intentioned ally, a male who wants to do the right thing and stand up for women, jumps in and defends at a point where A, you might have been perfectly capable of defending yourself, or B, you didn't want that because it makes you feel like you're somehow incapable of defending yourself or less. And that white knight syndrome, it's really hard because for a lot of men, I've spoken with a number of men, even in my own life, who genuinely want to do the right thing, and it's not easy to know at what point do you have to call it out, at what point do you have to report, and at what point are you actually taking away that agency and sense of power from that person, the victim, and that's why this reflection on duty to report and making it duty to respond, because responding doesn't necessarily entail reporting, but it means you have to do something. You can't ignore it. You can't brush it under the carpet. You can't just let it be. You have to respond, but responding appropriately. And that's where a lot of the training, and then going back to the previous recommendation, that's where a lot of the expertise is actually, we need external expertise of people who know about these things, who can give that training and guidance and be able to ensure that whatever it is that we do does not have the unintended consequences that many of the things that we've tried so far have had. So that's why, and then the rest of this talks about to be effective and successful against the complex problem of sexual violence. There we have it right there. In recommendations brought to us by survivors, talking about this as a very complex problem. If it was an easy problem, it would have been resolved. It is it is a very, very difficult problem. And the reason is because it isn't about the individual behavior. It is, as we've talked about, it's about the entire context, the entire culture, the assumptions, the preconceived notions, the ways in which people interact with each other. And again, I go back to Dr. Okros, who was extremely, really, good at explaining to us these power dynamics that happen, and that in any given space, we determine, and I think Mr. Bagnall was very self-reflective when he talked about this idea of who is most important in the room and how do we navigate that. And Madam Chair, I would say that in this particular room, you're sitting at the front of the room. That would indicate to many people that you are the most important person in this room. I would tend to agree. And Wasim, the clerk, is also is at the right hand, and we know sitting at the right or left of the chair puts you in a very elevated position. And so it immediately, if you didn't know anybody in this room and you walked into the room, you would immediately know certain things about importance. And then you would look to body language, and then you would look to the way in which people interact. And I would I would go back, though, when you talk about who is important and how we determine and how we try to elevate ourselves or diminish others in order to change those social structures of what is important. I'm going back to what happened earlier in this meeting when Mr. Bagnall was putting a sincere idea forward about how to get past this impasse, how to find consensus, and he was snickered at and laughed at. And one of the key ways that people determine power is through ridicule, diminishing, snickering, laughing. And we saw it right here in this room earlier today. And frankly, I am extremely disappointed because we are all members of Parliament, and I think we are held to a much higher standard in terms of our behavior, particularly to one another. But we know that that is the kind of behavior that is intended to diminish. It is intended to show who is important and not important. And we've seen it in other ways. We've seen it in use of language when men are referred to by their title or referred to by their last name, Mr. whoever, and women are almost always referred to by their first name. And in public settings, I mean, obviously, when you're in a personal environment, it's a different thing. But in a public, official, formal setting, there is a diminishing that happens when you refer to people by their first name as opposed to Mr. or whatever the title is. And these are all subtle things that we don't really know that we're doing. Although I would beg that earlier today, probably members did know what they were doing, but sometimes it's deliberate, sometimes it's not deliberate. But I do think that, frankly, we and I'll end here because I've got quite a few other recommendations, but I just want to say that I really hope that the committee, we worked very well together for the first year and a half that I was on this committee. And I know we're at an impasse, and I really hope that in some way we're going to be able to find a way past this impasse. If we could find something where we could put our own interests, put the survivors ahead, and make sure these recommendations get out. And that's why I'm reading them into the record. Thank you.
Suspended, suspendu. Merci beaucoup, tout le monde.
Thank you, everyone. Suspended.